Hi everybody, welcome back to CMN 201. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 14th of April, where I wanted to talk a little bit about Halloween, prepare us for the Blair Witch Project, and also talk a little bit about our final project. But first, there is a documentary. You're not required to watch it, but I highly encourage that you watch it, entitled Birth of the Living Dead, and you can see that in the notes below. And it gives a wonderful overview of Night of the Living Dead and why Night of the Living Dead was such an important film. And the website that I found, it seems that they want you to put in your birth date before you can actually view the movie. But once you put in your birth date, they allow you to view it. So as you can see, as we're getting closer and closer to contemporary times, it's getting more and more difficult to find free websites or free access to the things that we'll be watching. But I did test that website, and it seems to be just fine after you submit in your birth date if you're willing to do that. But it's about an hour and 15 minutes or so, and again, it talks about the significance of Night of the Living Dead, which we talked a little bit about as well, and not just in terms of the fact that we've got an African American lead and what that would have meant during that particular time period, and how ultimately that changes the narrative, but also some of the commentary that George Romero is making about the true monstrosity residing within us, our inabilities to work together, as well as his biting social commentary about authoritarian institutions and our inability to rely on government and police and other authoritarian institutions, which is a theme that we will see carried out in 28 Days Later, which is in many ways a homage to what George Romero did. And George Romero maintains that 28 Days Later is definitely not a zombie film because it violates the, quote, rules, unquote, that George Romero helped establish for zombies. If you know anything about 28 Days Later, it's about a viral outbreak. But the results are somewhat similar to what we would see in Night of the Living Dead or in that kind of tale. But that's coming up for the 2000s, and where we left off was talking about Halloween, which came out in 1978, but I wanted to use Halloween as an example for the 1980s. Before I get to that, though, you should be seriously thinking about your final project as we are headed into the home stretch of the semester. And I'd like you to please send me an email and tell me a little bit about what you're thinking about in relation to your final project so that I can help assist and direct you as we are in our last several weeks of this semester. But in terms of Halloween, we continue to see the collapse of the family, and that's something we also saw in Night of the Living Dead, for instance, when you've got even a child committing matricide. And that would have been quite shocking to audiences, but there were multiple scenes in that film that broke social taboos that were shocking to audiences. Notice that in Halloween, parents are visibly absent, and that's been one of the ways that that film has been read and interpreted. It's a commentary on a collapse of conservative social values, where you've got teenagers who don't necessarily have role models to guide their behavior. The result is that they engage in drug use and sexual activity, and that puts them at risk. And ultimately, the biggest risk is through their confronting evil in the persona of course, one of the most famous horror villains of our time, Michael Myers. And the Halloween director, I think I mentioned, John Carpenter, was a USC grad, University of Southern California. So in some ways, he has more of an academic background than many of the other filmmakers that we've watched thus far. And he was greatly influenced by Psycho, particularly the idea of looking and gazing, which we saw with Psycho, where we began the movie basically as kind of voyeurs, and then we see how Norman Bates is a voyeur. And we can see that in Halloween when we basically are looking through the eyes of the murderer, Michael Myers, in a way that kind of bonds us with the evil and the murderer. The idea that the doctor's name is Dr. Sam Loomis, So that's taken from Psycho. And a little bit of interesting trivia, Janet Leigh was the actress in Psycho, and her daughter, Jamie Lee Curtis, was basically the lead in Halloween. This was before Jamie Lee Curtis became an A-list actor. So probably Halloween is known, well, it's known for many reasons, but in particular that iconic soundtrack, which John Carpenter created himself, was released independently, and now we're in a position to talk about independent films. And when we talk about the Blair Witch Project, it's probably one of the most examples of a successful independent film. It was originally released regionally, first in Kansas City, and it was made on a $320,000 budget, and it grossed over $55 million in sales. So I think you can say that it was successful. It's one of the highest grossing films of all time. From a monetary perspective, it was successful, but in terms of it being a pop cultural icon, it was also successful because whether you've seen the film Halloween or not, you probably know about Michael Myers. And one of the things that Carpenter was able to do, even though he was filming in the 70s, so the technology wasn't as advanced as obviously it would be today, was to use a Panaglide, which was a kind of steady cam so that we could get that murderer's view. And most of the budget for the film went for that, and also for the casting of the role of the Doctor. So Donald Pleasence would have been the actor who would have commanded the highest salary at that particular point. And if you think about the 1980s, a time of Reaganism and a return to conservative values, it doesn't at all seem surprising that we've got a film where when those conservative values are questioned or in one way or another broken, the results, the consequence is murder and death. So that sexual promiscuity and smoking marijuana and all of the rest is ultimately punished in one way or another. And this sense of Michael wearing the mask, with a little bit of trivia here, that was actually a William Shatner mask. If you know William Shatner from Star Trek fame, who played Captain Kirk. And what they did was they just cut out the eyes. They hollowed out the eyes a little bit more. But this sense of what is appearance and what is reality, what lies under the mask. And that's something that we see too in Halloween in terms of what seems to be this idyllic suburban town, but that's masking lots of questionable behavior behind closed doors and an evil that cannot be killed. And Michael Myers is oftentimes read as a symbol of just societal evil that can never be destroyed completely, despite or in spite of the idyllic nature of Americana. And that's an idea that was also touched on in Psycho, that was also discussed in our text as well, but I think it's much more evident in something like Halloween, and that critique of suburbia, where the home is supposed to basically be the place of safety. Instead, it becomes the place of danger, and in many ways, it also is the place of imprisonment. When you think about the idea of the television basically entrapping the family. The knife, which is a common weapon in slasher films, is oftentimes read as a phallic image, just like guns are oftentimes read as phallic images as well. And there's even been some scholarship about the knife as an example of sexual frustration and repression. Perhaps one of the reasons why a very young Michael goes after his sister, because she's engaged in sexual behavior. But even if you didn't necessarily want to read some sort of a Freudian analysis into this, the perhaps resentment of a Michael Myers who's been abandoned by his parents and also has been abandoned by his sister, in effect, and that she's supposed to be watching him, but basically she's engaged in her own social activities and he's been left isolated and alone. Probably the most important piece of scholarship that's come out of Halloween and the slasher film movement is this idea of a final girl. That there is a female who survives at the end, who defies many of the gender stereotypes. Usually this final girl is someone who is virginal and who has not engaged in societal taboo behavior. And I think we can see that in the Jamie Lee Curtis figure, even though she did smoke a little bit of marijuana. But ultimately, the idea is that compared to her peers, she perhaps is the most, quote, deserving, unquote, to live if we view these films as a kind of conservative commentary. Now, John Carpenter has talked about this, and he said that that wasn't necessarily his intention when he was putting together these films. He wanted to try to do something as realistic as possible, and that teenagers would likely be engaged in these sorts of behaviors. He also had talked about that, to his surprise, no film had ever been named after the day, Halloween, and all of the mythology and the folklore associated with Halloween, so he wanted to take advantage of that. It reminds me a little bit about George Romero, who also talks about that he didn't necessarily have a deliberate commentary about ethnicity when he cast an African American actor in the lead role, but the reality is that that changed the narrative, and the fact that that actor and that character, I should say, is killed. That's what I should have said, not the actor. The character is killed at the end by the very institutions that are supposed to protect him, an authoritarian institutions such as law enforcement. And of course, that begs the question, would he have been killed if he was an African American? And those last grainy scenes are so chilling because in some ways it seems incredibly contemporary. Even though it's supposed to evoke images from the 1950s and the 1960s of guard dogs and meat hooks, which would have been the case during the civil rights movement, but also as contemporary as 2021 and police brutality against African American males in general. But this sense also of serial killers, I think, is something that Halloween was able to grasp on, that this was becoming a kind of fascination of the public, particularly as the media began to talk about some more contemporary serial killers, things like the Son of Sam and Ted Bundy. Though, of course, in this film, there is this supernatural element that this is more than just a serial killer. There is a boogeyman, and the way the film ends is with the supernatural possibility is that Michael can't be killed, whether he has some sort of supernatural qualities or, again, we wanted to view him somewhat symbolically. But in terms of thinking about the 1990s, it was a very interesting decade because it really was our transition into the technological world that we live in today. So it strikes me that the Blair Witch Project is a wonderful film to give a commentary about that, as well as a wonderful film to give a commentary about the ending of a century, 1999, and the beginnings of a new one, which we will talk about when we get to 28 Days Later. And that said, again, it's becoming increasingly more difficult for me to be able to find films available online. I found two websites for the Blair Witch Project, and I tried them both, and they both worked on my end, so I'm hopeful that they will work on your end. The first one actually has some has some translations at the bottom, but you can still hear the English, even though we've got the I'm trying to think of the right word. When we're watching foreign films and they actually put the translations at the bottom. The word escapes me at this point. It'll come to me as soon as I turn off this tape. So, but at any rate, the second one is from the website that I had used for The Exorcist. I had indicated that one of you had indicated that there were perhaps some problems with that particular website and some spam. But I've only heard from one of you, so I've got both websites there that you can try. And you can think about the Blair Witch Project as also a kind of phenomenon in and of itself, not just the film, but in the way that it was marketed. And that certainly nowadays we talk about fake news, and it was even less clear at the time in the way that they were able to use the internet to promote the film. It was less clear what was real and what was not real. So audiences walked into that film truly believing that there was a Blair Witch. And even the actors themselves were listed as deceased in film logs. So again, to keep that sense of fake authenticity. It also started the found footage movement that we've become accustomed to. It's very meta in many respects because it's a movie about a movie. And we started to see that a bit with George Romero when we've got Johnny, who basically says they're coming to get you, to Barbara. But it's much more clear cut at this particular point in time. So I thought what I would do is that I would leave you with the Blair Witch Project to view, and then next class we could talk a little bit more about Halloween and the Blair Witch Project, because I'm hoping that you might devote some time to watching that documentary about Night of the Living Dead. Again, you're not necessarily required to, but I hope you do so. And today's attendance question will be about the Blair Witch Project. And as you know, I've been using the decades as a way to sort of frame these films, arguing that these films are serving as a kind of commentary for the decade. So how do you think the Blair Witch Project represents the 1990s in America? And I know that these decades thus far might be decades that you didn't necessarily live through, that you're viewing them more through a historical lens. But obviously, as we get more and more contemporary, then the chances are greater that you've actually had personal experience with those decades. So I'll leave it at this for you to watch the Blair Witch Project, and my hope is that you also watch the documentary about Night of the Living Dead, and that you also send me an email with some thoughts about how you would like to proceed with your final project. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.